Hello students, good morning. Myself Professor Maulik Mehta and I am going to teach you the last topic of the JSP, Java Server Pages. Okay, so till now we have learned different topics of it and I hope you all understand it better. Okay, so our last topic will be JSP implicit objects. But before that, there are many queries come from the student that sir, you talked about web container, you talked about this word many a times in the lecture, but we don't know exactly what does it mean. So firstly, I would like to know you about the what is web container. Okay, so I will take 2 minutes or 5 minutes to make you understand that what is web container. Okay, so a web container is a component of a web server that interacts with the Java servlets. ઓકે, વેબ કન્ટેનર જે છે એક વેબ સર્વરનો પાર્ટ છે જે જાવા સર્વલેટ સાથે વર્ક કરે છે. ઇફ યુ વોન્ટ ટુ અન્ડરસ્ટેન્ડ ઇટ ઇન અ સિમ્પલ મેનર દેન યુ કેન મેક ઇટ એઝ ઇઝી એઝ ધ બ્રાઉઝર. ઓકે, અ વેબ કન્ટેનર મેનેજીસ ધ લાઈફ સાયકલ ઓફ સર્વલેટ્સ. What does it do? A web container manages the life cycle of servlet. It maps a URL to a particular servlet while ensuring that the requester has relevant access rights. What does it mean? કે આખી લાઈફ સાયકલને મેનેજ કરે છે. આપણી લાઈફ સાયકલના 3 પાર્ટ હતા, ઇનિટ, સર્વિસ અને ડિસ્ટ્રોય મેથડ. આ ત્રણેયને એકચ્યુઅલી સાથે કોણ મેનેજ કરે છે? તો મારું આ વેબ કન્ટેનર. એટલે તમે ઇનડાયરેક્ટલી કહેવા જાઓ તો મારો બ્રાઉઝરને ઓપન કરવું એટલે ઇનિટ, પછી સર્વિસ મેથડમાં રિક્વેસ્ટ રિસ્પોન્સ, અને એઝ સુન એઝ આઈ ક્લોઝ ધ બ્રાઉઝર ઇટ વિલ વર્ક એઝ અ destroy method. So ultimately, if I want to understand it in a simpler meaning, then it will be a web container is a web browser. I am not saying that web container is a web browser. It is a different thing. But if you want to understand the example of it, then it is very easier for you to understand. Okay, so what does it do? It maps a URL to a particular servlet while ensuring that the requester has the relevant access right. मतलब કે હું જે પર્ટિક્યુલર મારા સવલેટ માટે મેં જે રિક્વેસ્ટ કરેલી છે તો એની યુઆરએલને એના પર્ટિક્યુલર રિક્વેસ્ટરને જ એનો એક્સેસ મળે એની શ્યોરિટી કોણ આપે છે? મારું વેબ કન્ટેનર. ધ વેબ કન્ટેનર ઇમ્પ્લિમેન્ટ ધ વેબ કમ્પોનન્ટ આસ્પેક્ટ ઓફ ધ જાવા એન્જિનિયરિંગ આર્કિટેક્ચર. જે મારા વેબ કમ્પોનન્ટના જે ઇમ્પ્લિમેન્ટ જે બધી વસ્તુઓ મેં બનાવેલી છે એને એકચ્યુઅલીમાં એના જે એસ્પેક્ટ છે એને એકચ્યુઅલીમાં એનેબલ કોણ કરે છે? મારું વેબ કન્ટેનર. ઇટ સ્પેસિફાઈઝ અ રન ટાઈમ એન્વાયરમેન્ટ ફોર વેરિયસ કમ્પોનન્ટ સચ એઝ સિક્યુરિટી, concurrency, transaction and deployment. If you know about asset properties, if you remember in the DBMS there was a topic called asset properties. Okay, so such like that security. Now one of the most important part of the web container is providing a security. Why? Because web container works with the request and response which is directly work with the data. Now if you don't give a security to our data, then it will be a not healthier for you. Okay, so it specifies a runtime environment various components such as security, concurrency. Now what do you mean by concurrency? Multiple servlet at the same time. If you want to take an example of it, then you can take the task manager. You find that multiple applications are running simultaneously. For example, if you are downloading something from any application and if you are using WhatsApp or any other application, there are multiple events that happening together, which is known as concurrency. Now what is transaction? Now in our physical world, transaction means if you give something and you take something. So in our aspect, transaction means you request something and you get response something. Okay, so this is about transaction. And deployment. Deployment means ultimately that what will be the final output of it. So deployment will be done by the web container. Okay, so now how it looks with the graph. Look at the diagram of it. So first of all, request has been done by the client and it will go on through the database as a request. Who does this thing? This will be done by the web server, or you can say web container. In our term, if you take example of browser, then browser will take request in the form of servlet and give it to the database. The database will respond it in the form of object and will give the client again with the use of container. So this is about the web container. Okay, now what is web container actually do and why it is important? Because Java servlet does not have defined main method. Now જાવા સવલેટ છે એની પાસે મારી કોઈ ડિફાઇન મેઇન મેથડમાં ડિફાઇન કરેલી નથી. સો અ કન્ટેનર ઇઝ રિક્વાયર્ડ ટુ લોડ ધેમ. Why? Because I need a container who load the main method. It does not have its own method. Okay, the servlet gets deployed on the container. મારું જે એક્ઝિક્યુશન થશે, the execution of servlet will be done on the container. Okay, let's have a look what happens when a client sends a certain request that requires interaction with the servlet. Now it is basically a work of a web container. Okay, you can simplify these points in the form of what are the usages of what are the benefits of web container. So look at this. First one is the client sends a request to a web server. Okay, then the web server which contains a servlet sends the request to the container. The container passes the request to the respective servlet. The servlet methods are loaded. The servlet hands over the relevant response to the container, which passes it to the server. Eventually the response reaches the client. If you want to understand in the terms of graph, so first of all what will happen, the client will send a request to a web server, which is basically a web container. Now that web container works with servlet. It will receive the request from the client. Okay, then the servlet methods are loaded. Okay, and after the loading of the servlet's method, the appropriate response will be given to the container, and ultimately that container, what does it have? The servlets. The response of the servlets will be given to the client again. So this is all about the container. I hope you understand what is web container and how it works. So ultimately, as I said earlier, that if you want to understand the web container, you take the example of web browser, then you will understand it very easily. Okay, now the main thing that we will talk about in today's lecture will be the last topic of the JSP, which is the implicit objects. Now what are the implicit objects and what are the usage of it, we will discuss about in this lecture. So look at this. So implicit objects are created by the web container and contain information related to a particular request, page or application. Okay, it is created by the web container, and એ શું રાખે છે, it has some information regarding the request, page or application. To simplify code in JSP expression and scriptlets, you are supplied with the 8 automatically defined variables. હવે I am taking some more example, more variables. Why? Because if you have your book, then you find that there are total number of 8 implicit objects in your book, but in real life you require mostly 9 implicit objects. So I will take one extra, which is exception, because in your textbook there is no object called exception, but when you are doing code, you know that the exception are very important. So I will take this as well. Okay, so to simplify code in JSP expression and scriptlets, you are supplied with 9 automatically defined variables, sometimes called implicit objects. This is all about the implicit objects. The available variables are request, response, out, session, application, config, page context, page, and the exception. Okay, so this is all about the list of the implicit objects. Okay, so it is being created by the web container, and I hope you understand what is web container. So ultimately, if you want to understand, then all things will be done by the web browser. Okay, so now look at each object in depth. Now first of all, what is JSP out implicit objects? Okay, so this is print writer object used to send output to the client. out જે મારું વેરિયેબલ છે એ શેના માટે છે? to send output to the client. You can adjust the buffer size through the use of buffer attribute of the page directive, which we will discuss about in the previous lecture. Also note that out is used almost exclusively in scriptlets, since JSP expressions automatically get placed in output stream and thus rarely need to refer to out explicitly. What does it mean? That તમારું કંઈ જે આઉટપુટ આવી રહ્યું છે, it will be done by the output implicit object. For writing any data to the buffer, JSP provides an implicit object named out. It is the object of JSP writer. In case of servlet, you need to write. What does it mean? That whatever the output will become in the form of servlet will become in the form of out implicit object. Okay, so this is about the out variable. Now we will talk about the JSP request implicit object. So this is the HTTP servlet request object associated with the request and lets you access request parameters. Okay, so the JSP request is an implicit object of type HTTP servlet request. જે મેં તમને પ્રમાણે કીધું, it is the type of HTTP servlet request and access the parameters via get parameter method, the request type આપણે get post method જે કરી હતી, and the incoming HTTP headers, cookies ને બધા જે આપણે વાત કરી હતી, get method, put method ને એ બધી જે વાત કરી હતી કે cookies ની વાત કરી હતી, it will be all done by the request implicit object. So if you want to understand it better, so whatever the client request is to the server, it will be done in the form of request implicit object. Okay, the JSP request is an implicit object of HTTP servlet request, for example created for each JSP request by the web container. It can be used to get request information such as parameter, header information, remote address, server name, server port, content type, character encoding, etc. It can also be used to set, get and remove attributes from the JSP request scope. So ultimately what તમારા રિક્વેસ્ટથી તમારે કોઈક વસ્તુને કંઈ પણ કરવું છે, what you want to do with your database, you can do anything with the request implicit object. So ultimately request is generally used in the for the requesting to modify your data as well as to pass the information and all of that. Okay, now we will talk about the JSP response implicit object. So in JSP response is an implicit object of HTTP servlet response. Request હતું એ કોનો ઓબ્જેક્ટ ટાઈપ હતો? servlet request નો. And now response implicit object is the type of servlet response. The instance of HTTP servlet response is created by the web container for each JSP request. મારા એક request માટે મારો response create થશે and it has been done by the implicit object. So this is the HTTP servlet response associated with the response to the client. Note that since the output stream is buffered, it is legal to set HTTP status codes and response header, even though this is not permitted in regular servlets once any output has been sent to the client. What does it mean? જો અહીંયા લખેલું છે એ પ્રમાણે, it can be used to add or manipulate response. Now ultimately what we have seen till now, that you can't do anything or you can't edit your response, but with the use of response implicit object you can do it. So it can be used to add or manipulate response, such as redirect response to another resource, send error, etc. Now what does it mean? That if you have multiple servlets and multiple requests, so now understand that one of the servlets output will be work as one of the input of the servlets, so it can send data to that servlet also with the use of implicit objects. Okay, now the next implicit object is config. Now what is config? Configuration. So this is the servlet config object for this page. Okay, in JSP config is an implicit object of servlet configuration. This object can be used to get initialization parameter for a particular JSP page. The config object is created by the web container for each JSP page. Generally, it is used to get initialization parameter from the web.xml file. Ultimately, શું એનો મતલબ થયો કે મારું જેટલું કન્ફિગરેશન છે એ બધું ડન કયા થશે? આના implicit objectથી. So basically, if you want to understand what is implicit object, so ultimately whatever the request, whatever the error, or whatever the request, response, session, application, whatever you learn in the JSP, all has to done in the form of object. That's why we call Java as a object oriented programming. Okay, now we will talk about the fifth our object, which is application. Okay, this is the servlet context as obtained via get servlet config method and get context method. Now what does it mean? In JSP application, it is implicit object of type servlet context. Okay, the instance of servlet context is created only once by the web container when application or project is deployed on the server. Only has been created once during the life cycle of the servlet. This object can be used to get initialization parameter from configuration file. It can also be used to get, set or remove attribute from the application scope. What does it mean? કે મારે આની અંદર get scope, get છે, set છે, remove કંઈ પણ કરવું હશે, it will be done by the application object. The initialization parameter can be used by all JSP page. Okay, આનું જે initialization છે, it will be used by the all JSP page. Now we will talk about the session object. In JSP, session is an implicit object of type HTTP session. The Java developer can use this object to set, get or remove attribute or to get session information. Now what does it mean? You can do with same with the previous our object which was application, but if you want to specifically with the session, you can do with the session object. Okay, so this is the HTTP session object associated with the request. Sessions are created automatically, so this variable is bound even if there was no incoming session reference except you turn off in page directive. In this case, attempt to reference the session variable cause errors at the time JSP is translated into a servlet. Now, what do you know what is session? I talked about in the previous lecture as well. You can go and revise that topic, that how session works in the session tracking. Okay, now we will talk about the page context implicit object. Now what is context? So the encapsulate use of servlets, the encapsulate use of server specific features like high performance JSP writer. The idea is that if you access them through this class rather than directly, your code will still run on regular servlet. Okay, what does it mean? So in JSP page context is an implicit object of page context class. The page context objects can be used to set, get or remove attribute from the following scope. શું કહેવા માંગે છે, જે મારો કન્ટેક્સ્ટનો ઓબ્જેક્ટ છે એની અંદર મારે સેટ, ગેટ અને રિમૂવ કરવા છે એટ્રીબ્યુટ વિચ આર નોટ નેસેસરી ઓર વિચ આર મોર નેસેસરી. I will be do with the use of set and get or remove by removing that attribute. All will be done by the page context object. So which are the scopes? Page, request, session and application. In JSP, page scope is the default scope. Okay, my by default any value કઈ હશે? Page scope ની. Now we will talk about the implicit object, page implicit object. Okay, now what is this? Is simply a synonym for this, and it is not very useful in Java. It is not very useful in Java. It was created as a placeholder for the time when the scripting language could be something other than Java. What does it mean? જ્યારે મારે સ્ક્રિપ્ટિંગ લેંગ્વેજ અધર દેન જાવા હશે ત્યારે જનરલી આનો યુઝ થતો હોય છે, પણ મોસ્ટ પ્રોબેબલી ઇફ યુ આર યુઝિંગ JSP, most people are using the Java language. Okay, so in JSP, page is an implicit object of type object class. This object is assigned to the reference of auto generated servlet class. It is written as how it can be written. So this is the example of it. Object type, object page is equal to this, and this is all about the implicit object. Now the ninth object, which is exception. Now do you know what is exception? So whenever the error comes, they required an exception. Whenever your program have some problem or having some problem regarding the output, it generates some exception. Okay, so in JSP, exception is an implicit object of type java.lang.throwable class. This object can be used to print the exception. Now whatever the error comes, it should print the exception, but it can only be used in error pages. It is better to learn it after page directive. Okay, whatever we learn about page directive, we learned in the previous thing that however the page directive works. In the previous lecture we talked about the directive. So this is all about the implicit object. You find many example of it on the web. If you require the example of each and every object, you can find or you can text me and whenever you require to understand that how this all object will work in the manner. Okay, you find the multiple programs or multiple codes that how you will use all these objects. So this is all about the your implicit objects in JSP page. I hope you understand it better, and this is the end of our chapter, which is JSP. Now I hope you understand all the JSP attributes, its life cycle, attributes, its characteristics, session method, and everything whatever you have learned in this method. Okay, so this is all about the JSP. I hope you understand this chapter better, and we will talk about the next topic in the next lecture. Till then, thank you so much, and if you have any doubt you can text me whenever you want to have problem. Okay, so thank you so much, have a great